Okay, this is my Wort Boggart Auntie Commander deck, and this is one of my favorite decks to play because it's both explosive and unique. And one of the reasons I think this deck is unique is because most decks are usually combo control or aggro or just straight control. And this is one of the few decks that you can play as a combination of aggro and combo. So you don't usually see that combination together. Another reason it's unique is that as far as aggro decks go, most aggro decks are more of a big beat strategy. They'll rely on sort of one or two big creatures and they protect them, whereas this aggro deck relies on more of a blitz strategy, so a ton of small creatures and pumping them and getting through really quickly. So when it does kill people with an aggro strategy, it does so really quickly. And another reason this deck is unique is that it uses red not just as a support color, but as one of the main colors. So a lot of the key cards are red, and you're relying on a very red-based strategy, which you don't see a lot in Commander. So as far as the characteristics of this deck go, it's a tribal deck, so a lot of the creatures are goblins. Any creature you run benefits heavily from Goblin Tribal. And also it's a graveyard recursion deck, and graveyard recursion is always popular in Elder Dragon Highlander or Commander because graveyard recursion means resiliency, it means card advantage, and it means a strong emphasis on the end game, which is all very important for an aggro deck. So I'm going to take you through this deck card by card, and maybe you'll get some ideas. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about Wort herself. Now as far as generals go, she's not necessarily integral to the success of the deck, however she's very relevant. So if I go through the whole game without ever having to cast her, that's fine, but most of the time I'm going to want her on the table. Her ability here sort of defines the two characteristics of the deck. She benefits from the Goblin tribe, so all the creatures in my deck, I'm going to try to have as many goblins as possible. And she also has graveyard shenanigans. Now, as far as her body, she's a 3/3 fear for 4, which isn't huge, but she definitely contributes to the aggro theme of the deck. And as a fear creature, she's really good at wielding equipments. So mostly her role in the deck is to serve as a recursion engine if I have goblins with good come into play abilities, or she's just there to safeguard my most important creatures and make sure that I can keep getting them back. So now I'm going to go through all the creatures. Okay, so these are the creatures in the deck, and this is what the mana curve looks like. As you would expect, it's pretty low. Most of them cost 3 or 4 mana. And as you would expect, most of these creatures are goblins to fit the tribal theme. There are only a handful of non-goblins. And also, most of these creatures, they contribute to the blitz aggro strategy that we talked about before. So a lot of these guys are going to do tons of damage in a short amount of time. And also, because aggro decks are generally at a disadvantage in Commander, we're going to play a lot of goblins that are resilient and generate card advantage, since any successful aggro deck in this format needs to be able to accomplish those two things. So now I'm going to take you through these creatures one by one. Okay, so we're going to start with these two guys. Because we're playing a blitz deck and we're trying to deal 40 damage as fast as possible, we need to get as many goblins out as soon as possible. So that's what these guys are going to help us do. Frogtosser Banneret reduces the cost of all my goblins by 1. And this guy, Goblin Warchief, also reduces the cost of my goblin spells. He also gives them all haste, which makes the deck way faster, and it gives you the element of surprise, so anything you play can attack the turn it comes out before they have a chance to respond. So these guys are both really important. So like I said, we need to get as many goblins into play as soon as possible, and these 3 cards right here are going to help us cheat goblins into play without paying the mana cost. This first guy here, Goblin Lackey, comes down on the first turn, and he'll let me put goblins from my hand into play every time I deal combat damage. Now the reason this guy is so good is because in Commander, there's rarely any player with any sort of board presence on the first turn. So he's not going to have any blockers to deal with, he's not going to face much removal. He's just going to start building up a board presence right away. Wort Instigator, basically the same thing, except he has double the effect. And this guy's really key because he can sneak something into play before regular combat damage. Now that's interesting when you look at something like Goblin Pyromancer, which will pump all the goblins in play. So that'll mean that Wort Instigator will get this guy into play, and everything's going to, get +3 power before the regular combat damage resolves, and that's a big surprise. Another example, Goblin Matron. If I sneak that into play on first strike damage, then I can tutor up something and get that into play on the second trigger. So that's It's a pretty interesting way to use Wort and Instigator. Another thing to remember is that he's got double strike, so he can become a really aggressive creature once you pump him with equipment or lords or whatever. This guy here, Goblin Wizard, he's not very cheap at 4 mana, so he doesn't come out until later on, but he can tap and put something into play at instant speed rather than at, during combat. So he can be a big surprise. He's also got this other random ability here to give your goblins protection from white. A lot of the time that's not going to mean anything, but if you're actually playing against a heavy white deck, then this is going to protect you guys from path and swords and blockers and stuff, so he's pretty interesting. So next we're going to talk about goblins who give us tutoring capabilities. And obviously any Elder Dragon Highlander deck needs to have access to some tutors, because you've only got access to one of each card. And being able to tutor will give you more consistency. You'll be able to find the stuff you need every game. These two here, Goblin Matron and Boggart Harbinger, pretty much the same thing. They come into play and search your deck for a goblin. Put it in your hand or on top of your deck. Now this one here, Goblin Recruiter, he's pretty interesting. Comes into play, search your deck for any number of goblins and put them on top of your deck. On his own, it's a pretty solid card, but usually he's used in conjunction with Goblin Ringleader here. When he comes into play, look at the top 4 cards of your deck and put all goblin cards revealed this way into your hand. Now, it's pretty obvious how this works. You play the Goblin Recruiter, find 5 goblins from your deck, including this guy, and make sure he's on top. So when you play him, you get the 4 cards from your deck, and you know what you're going to see. So the net gain here with this combo is tutor your deck for 4 goblins and put them into your hand, which is pretty ridiculous. And the Goblin Ringleader, he's not bad on his own. Usually he'll come out and you'll get at least 1 or 2 if you're lucky. So now we've got some Goblin Lords. Lords are always great for blitz strategies because they benefit from having lots of creatures in play. This first one here, Mad Auntie, pretty good. Gives you access to regeneration, so you'll be able to keep your combo pieces alive. Goblin King. This one is interesting. Well, obviously it gives all you guys +1/+1, and Mountain Walk, usually that's not going to mean much, but if there's one player on the table, if your opponent happens to control a mountain, then this is an absolute bomb. All you guys being unblockable, there's a lot of damage that they won't be able to stop. So he's actually a really good tutor target if you find yourself playing against a red deck. And Goblin Chieftain here, like I said with Goblin Warlord, being able to give all you guys haste gives you sort of preemptive attack, and it'll make it hard for your opponent to respond. So he's a really good card. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about some of the most aggressive creatures in this deck. This first guy here is Siege Gang Commander. He's going to give you 4 goblins for 5 mana, and that's pretty important because we're going for a blitz strategy. So if I happen to have any of my lords out, then each of these guys is going to get pumped and it's going to become very aggressive. Another thing to note about this guy is the sack outlet, which is important because we're playing a graveyard shenanigans deck, and it's often important to be able to sacrifice something and recur it with Wort maybe. But also it's just great for getting the last few points of damage in, and it's, awesome creature removal as well. On to Boggart Mob. This guy is great because, well, he's a 5/5 for 4, so that makes him one of the biggest bodies in the deck. And he like Siege Gang Commander, he generates a ton of tokens. Now, the champion ability, some people think that's a drawback because, you have to lose one of your goblins. But actually, in this deck, it contributes to the resiliency, because you're able to champion a goblin, and usually your board is going to get wiped, and this guy will help you retain one of your goblins that you lost. Hopefully something with a come-into-play ability like one of your tutoring goblins. Goblin Piledriver is one of the biggest bodies you can put on the board early, because, if you play something like Siege Gang Commander, you've got a ton of attacking goblins, then he's going to become, the strongest threat on the board pretty quickly. And obviously protection from blue means he's going to destroy a Zami decks or, Zur decks or whatever. So he's pretty relevant. This last guy here, Goblin Pyromancer, probably the best win condition when we're going for a blitz strategy. I think he's got a bit of a bad rep because people think he's got this drawback here, destroying all goblins, and maybe your opponent will be able to take advantage of that, bribery him or something. But, play this guy dozens and dozens of times, and he's never really been a big of a problem. Usually you're going to find a way to neutralize the drawback. Something like Skirk Prospector or Cauldron Dance to get him into play, and then kill him before end of turn so you don't lose your board. But like I said, this guy's going to win a ton of games all on his own. He's going to turn a non-threatening position into a winning position, and you'll be able to do 30 damage in 1 turn easily. Something like Kiki-Jiki, for example, will give you 2 Goblin Pyromancers, Uh, you know, all your goblins are attacking for 7 at least. So he's definitely the most important aggressive card in the deck. Okay, next we've got some creatures that are great at doing some extra damage. This first guy here, Skirk Fire Marshal. He's one of the few goblins in the deck which will give us access to a board wipe. 10 damage to each creature and each player. He's also great for just getting in the last few bits of damage. Usually after the first initial blitz, your opponent's pretty close to dead, and this guy's great at finishing the job. He's especially good, for example, a Siege Gang Commander, and that's instantly 5 goblins, so you can pull that off pretty easily. I've seen it pulled off twice in one turn. I've seen it kill 3 players at once. This guy is great for finishing the game. Next one here, Murderous Redcap. Not a whole lot to say. He's just a very efficient card. He's going to kill some of the utility creatures on the board, and Persist will give you access to some resiliency, and so he's great to recur. Goblin Sharpshooter is an interesting one. At first glance, it doesn't look like he's going to do much, just sort of pings for 1 every turn or whatever. But actually, in this deck, there's a ton of goblins dying all the time, especially in a multiplayer game, and this guy is going to be working overtime, tapping over and over, and you'd be surprised how often he can just kill a creature on the board, dealing 3 damage to him somehow. So this guy's actually surprisingly good. This last one here, Lightning Crafter. Again, it's a championing creature, and just like Boggart Mob, we talked about how championing can actually be useful rather than a drawback. Taps for 3 damage, so he's going to kill creatures on the board. And as you'll see later, he's actually one of the key cards in the deck for pulling off a combo win.